Hello, I'm Andrew Kamei-Deitch, and we're continuing our look at pre-modern Japan. Today we're going to be talking about the impact of a new group on Japan during the Sengoku era, namely the Europeans. Now, from the mid to late Sengoku period, the warfare had been intensifying between these powerful warrior hegemons, but the situation was soon complicated further when the Europeans arrived. To put this in context, we have to go back a little bit and talk about the global context of the late medieval era. Now, recall the West-East trade situation. We talked a little bit earlier, back when I talked about the Nara period, about the Silk Road, the traditional network that had linked up the Eastern and Western civilizations. However, in the early medieval era, the Islamic empires in Arabia and Central Asia had broken the Silk Road, breaking apart the connections between the East and the West, and this caused a big problem for Europeans who had come to depend on spices and other commodities from the East. They had to find some other way to access those commodities. Now, the first group to try to break the Arab spice monopoly were the Portuguese. They tried to sail to Asia from the end of the 15th century, and this helped to fuel the era of exploration. Now, here we have the Silk Road and the traditional maritime routes that I talked about before. These ceased to be viable in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. From this point on, the Europeans either had to sail around Africa and get to Asia that way, or they had to find some other way of doing it. So, as I said, this fueled the era of exploration. So, Europeans would set out trying to find a way to Asia in order to access that rich commodity market. Of course, on the way to doing so, eventually some of them came up with the idea that they could sail backwards around the world and crash into Asia from the rear, most famously, of course, Christopher Columbus. I think we tend to assume these days that people at the time in Europe thought the world was flat and that therefore this idea was preposterous, they would fall off the side of the world or something. This is sort of a fantasy that was made up by later generations to make explorers look bad. The big criticism against these early missions of exploration was not that they were going to fall off a world, it's that the calculations suggested that the world was so big that it would take forever to sail back around the world and get to Asia from that way, and therefore it was not viable. Essentially, Columbus had succeeded because he was bad at math. He was able to convince people that the world was in fact a little bit smaller than they had thought. And, of course, ironically, he was wrong, and therefore he hit America around where he had expected to find India. Well, nevertheless, he was not the only one, and this, of course, soon contributed to the creation of a new set of trade routes. Here you can see we have a series of trade routes by the Portuguese and the Spanish linking up the New World and the Old. Now, as a result of this, the Portuguese were able to access Asia more readily over time, and so in 1453 Portuguese traders arrive in Japan, and they were responsible for introducing many things to Japanese society. For example, tempura. Nowadays, when we think about tempura, we consider it to be a kind of quintessentially Japanese dish, but tempura was actually based on Portuguese cooking. In fact, the word comes from the Portuguese term tempero, which meant cooking. Then we have bread. Even today in Japan, the word we use for bread is pan. Pan, of course, comes from the Portuguese word for bread. Tobacco, one of the things that Europeans picked up in the New World and brought back to Europe and other places. So tobacco, of course, was also introduced by the Portuguese. And playing cards. In fact, there had been traditional matching games that people had played in Japan that they sort of updated using the idea of playing cards that they got from the Portuguese. But there are three particularly important things that they introduced on top of these, namely firearms, castles, and Christianity. Let's take a look at each of those. So, three imports that transformed Japan. Firearms, castles, Christianity. First up, firearms. The Europeans were not the first people to bring firearms into Japan. In the early medieval era, there had been earlier experiments with firearms. You might recall back when I talked about the Mongol invasions, that I mentioned some of the explosive devices that the Mongols had been using. There were also in Japan certain types of old sort of cannon that had been introduced based on Chinese designs, but they weren't very reliable or very powerful. And so really the significant role here was played by Europeans in introducing what we would now call the forerunners of modern firearms. This was something that started out in a kind of accidental way. The Portuguese arrived on Tanegashima in 1543. They ended up being shipwrecked there, and so they sold the local daimyo in the area 2 of their matchlock muskets. They went and showed them in action, shooting down some birds. He was very impressed, purchased these 2, and then promptly had them reverse engineered. Once they understood how these devices worked, Japanese engineers were able to spread this technology from place to place. Soon there were many firearms in Japan, both imported ones from European manufacturers and ones being produced by domestic creators. So this is an example of, these are 17th century models, but just to give us some sense of what these weapons look like. So, matchlock muskets. Now, the significance of these, of course, was not in using them one-on-one. The idea was that you could get a group of people together and deploy these on the field by using a method of rotating volleys. You have a group of people all fire their guns and then drop down behind another group who can fire their guns over their heads, because of course it took quite a long time to reload your weapons in between shots. Now, there were some distinct advantages and disadvantages to using these weapons. Obviously, the first advantage we can think of is that they were easy to use. It took minimal training. However difficult using a gun effectively may be, it's a lot easier than the time and training it would take to acquire proficient skill with sword and bow. And so it was possible for local daimyo to grab a group of local people together and then get them up to a decent level of gun proficiency in a short length of time. So that was one advantage, especially if you had to replace people on the battlefield quickly. Another advantage that these weapons had was stopping power, particularly helpful if you're facing a group of people charging at you on their horses. You can take them out with these types of weapons because of the stopping power, pushing back that these weapons have. So that's one of the most important distinctions between these and archers. There are, of course, disadvantages to using these. First of all, they were unusable in rough weather. So the powder would get wet and it would be impossible to use these weapons in those circumstances. They also had limited range and accuracy, so they didn't quite shoot where they were supposed to. And they had a very slow reloading speed. So you really had to have a critical size group in order to make up for some of these disadvantages. And again, if it was a very rough, rainy day, then you had to fall back on other types of weapons. Castles, the second thing. Well, if we think about fortifications in the history of Japan, we find earlier examples of fortifications. Things like people fortifying a hill, fortifying a temple, something like that. But we don't really find anything analogous to European castles until this time period. So castle building technology is introduced by the Europeans. Unlike European castles at the time, Japanese castles were mainly reinforced wooden structures on top of stone foundations. That's because, unlike European fortresses, they weren't designed to stop cannon. Cannon manufacturing at the time was very hit and miss, and the only people that were really able to build very powerful, effective cannons had been the people back in Europe. These cannons, of course, they couldn't get on ships, and therefore people were limited in terms of much smaller cannon that they were able to put on board their ships and take to other countries. This meant that Japanese castle builders didn't really have to worry about being attacked by massive-scale fortress-shattering cannons. They only had to worry about small cannons and mainly small arms fire muskets and this type of thing. So from this point of view, if you just had kind of a strong stone foundation and then a wooden fortress on top, this was perfectly sufficient for meeting that need. So we have this kind of interesting transformation where castle building is introduced to Japan and it takes off at exactly the same time that advanced cannon back in Europe were making castles less useful. Now, the function of these castles was obviously to secure strategic locations, but there was another element. They were also designed to serve as the home and the seat of power of a daimyo, and therefore castles had to impress their rivals and display one's power. So there's been a lot written about how Japanese castles are so beautiful and so forth. And of course, this is part of the design. They are supposed to impress you. You are supposed to look at a castle and think, wow, anyone who lives in this amazing castle must be so impressive and powerful that I would not want to mess with that person, and therefore I do not want to fight them. And that, of course, means the castle is doing its job. It's not just supposed to make you afraid to attack it from a military standpoint, it's also supposed to impress you and kind of disarm you socially when you are confronted by this amazing sight. So we can say Japanese castles are beautiful by design. Of course, perhaps Japan's most famous castle is this one, Himeji Castle, still a major tourist attraction today. Of course, it didn't quite look like this when it was first built. This is a product of Edo period reconstruction, but it does just give us a sense of how these castles were built at the time. So you would have sort of the central castle, and then kind of analogous to the keep in Europe, and then you would have layers of interweaving walls built around it to sort of keep in that territory and make it harder to attack. So the third thing we're going to introduce, Christianity. Well, where does this come from? In response to the religious wars that were happening in Europe at the time, there had been the Reformation and then of course the Counter-Reformation. Christians of various sects had been traveling around the world trying to recruit converts. Many of the missions of exploration took priests with them. Essentially, they made a bargain with whatever church they were representing when they would receive money and support for their expedition, and in exchange they had to bring priests with them so that if they met local people in any land they discovered, they would try to convert them to their strain of Christianity. So it's in this sort of situation that we find Francis Xavier coming to Japan in 1549. Now, Francis Xavier is still widely known by Japanese school children today. He was a Jesuit, this kind of elite group of Catholic scholars and evangelists, and so he's the one who first brings Christianity to Japan. Now, contrary to our modern perceptions, there is initially a good rapport between the Jesuits and the Japanese warriors. We tend to have this stereotype that there was a massive cultural and religious gulf between the Westerners and the Japanese, and therefore right from the start there was no way this was going to work, and it was just a matter of time before conflict broke out. This is simply not true. Early on we find that there are actually a lot in common. There were shared values of discipline and dedication and righteous behavior. Samurai talked about how when they met the Jesuits, they said, yes, they're strange people, they have strange cultural practices, but they seem very dedicated, they talk about ethics a lot, the importance of righteous behavior. You know, this was something that they could relate to. This was a big part of warrior culture, so that was something they had in common. Also, Christianity seemed quite similar to Pure Land Buddhism. At the most superficial level, we have the idea that, well, the world is this really bad place, and everything is bad, and you can't really save yourself, but don't worry, there is this great powerful being, and if you believe in him, whether it's Jesus or the Buddha Amida, he will save you and then carry you off to a better land in the next life. Well, so the Jesuits are trying to explain Christian theology, and Japanese warriors are saying, yeah, we get this. You know, we understand where this is coming from. So, that wasn't the only thing. The Jesuits also were quite interested in Japanese culture. They tried to act respectful, they tried to learn the Japanese language and traditions, and this all made a pretty good impression. So, as a result, they were actually quite successful. They gained a lot of influence. They gained a lot of converts. Of course, some of their converts had only joined the religion for trading opportunities, but nevertheless, they did convert. But the Jesuits began to get sucked more and more into local politics. They began to take sides in disputes, and the more that they gained power, the more that they made enemies. Then the situation got even more complicated because more Europeans began to show up. By the early 1600s, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the English had all arrived as well. And the European rivalries and religious divisions were then duplicated in Japan. So the Protestants tried to make the Catholics look bad, and vice versa. The various nationals tried to make people from other countries look bad, and this tended to make the Japanese rulers a bit suspicious, so it made the situation worse and worse. At the same time, groups like the Franciscans began converting the poor masses, and this created another problem, because just like had happened when Pure Land Buddhism first started off in Japan, the big concern was not really with religious ideas per se. The problem was if a religious idea supported the social system or not. And having a group of religious missionaries convert a lord who then told everyone in his domain, you have to follow my religion, that was one thing. Having a whole group of people en masse suddenly convert to a religion, if the lords had not been consulted, this looked as if it was going to be fostering social instability, and that was a major concern. From a Japanese point of view, all of this seemed to increase the tension and threatened the established social order. And remember, at the time, this is not a situation where we have a lot of social order to begin with. There's already a lot of instability going on. It's understandable why people would have been concerned. So eventually what began to happen was the Japanese elites cracked down on Christianity and they limited the trade with the Europeans. Aside from the Dutch, all of the Europeans chose to leave or they were expelled. Meanwhile, the Japanese were prohibited from overseas travel. This proved particularly problematic because there were a lot of Japanese traders and other people who were actually living outside Japan when this edict was passed, and then they were unable to return home. The Christians in Japan tried to respond to this situation by launching a rebellion in 1637. It was absolutely disastrous and ended up being very forcefully suppressed. Thousands and thousands of people died. This, of course, contributed to the very negative image of Christianity in Japan at the time. The idea that it was a threat to social order, that it made people crazy, and so forth. So after this, Japanese Christians were forced to go underground. So they did continue to exist, but they were not officially recognized. They were very much underground in hiding and pretended on the surface not to be Christian. So if we look at this from a broad perspective, we can say that the encounters between the Europeans and the Japanese were initially productive to both sides, but this relationship was then destroyed, not really by cultural issues or by differences in religious thinking, but actually by politics, European rivalry, and even fears of foreign domination. So although extensive contact between these two forces was actually quite brief, it did play a significant role at the time. Thank you very much.